So we move on to Act 3, Scene 5, and this is a scene which is debated whether or not it was part of the original play. A lot of critics think that this has been added in later for dramatic purpose. Regardless to whether it was added in later or not, it is still part of the play that you will be being assessed on, and therefore we do need to look at it in some detail. This scene can be quite useful if you get a question on the supernatural. So this scene centres around Hecate or Hecate, depending on which pronunciation you go with, who was the goddess in Greek mythology who was in charge of witchcraft and mischief. She was also the goddess of the crossroads. It's important to note that she predates the Olympians, so she wasn't part of Zeus's family and is somewhere between the Titans and the gods. And she was capable of both good and evil. At the time, she was neither malevolent or benign. She was a combination of both, depending on what act she was taking part in. She's especially associated with witchcraft, magic, the moon, doorways, and creatures of the night, such as hellhounds and ghosts, which is clearly linked with some of the scenes that we see with the dagger and with Banquo's ghost, which we have already just seen. She is often depicted carrying a torch, which reminds us of her connection to the night, and she often is depicted as a sculpture with 3 heads, which represents her role as the guardian of the crossroads. I want to draw your attention back to Act 2, Scene 1, when Macbeth was at those crossroads. So we see references to Hecate or Hecate at pivotal moments in the play where Macbeth has a decision to make. She's an interesting character in the sense that when we first see her, she's actually telling the witches off for interfering. She says, how could you do this without me? She's very much the dominant force over the supernatural world. So once again, when the witches are introduced, we see thunder and lightning. They are on the heath in an abandoned and isolated place, again showing their vulnerability and the disruption they cause to nature. The first witch notices that Hecate looks angry with them, and she responds by saying, I've got a reason to be angry with you. You've dared to trade and traffic with Macbeth in riddles and affairs of death. So she's looking at the way the witches have spoken to Macbeth with that ambivalent language that we've seen, with them saying one thing, but it can be interpreted in many ways. Her spite here and the way that she approaches the witches and telling them off for the things that they've done is deliberately intended to echo the way that Lady Macbeth speaks to Macbeth. Hecate here is a vindictive female spirit, and her presence here is thinking about that question that we keep going back to. Can we entirely blame Macbeth for his own downfall? Perhaps in Hecate's opinion, he is. She then goes on to admonish the witches further, saying that everything they've done has been for a wayward son. She says that he loves for his own ends, not for the witches and not for evil. That actually all of the acts that Macbeth has committed, all the murders and what he's done and how he's behaved, is because he's selfish rather than evil. It's because he's ambitious and greedy, not because by nature he wants to cause harm to others. We can interpret this in 2 ways. It invites us to sit back and consider whether we agree with that or not. Do we think that Macbeth has just been waylaid because of his ambition? He said earlier on, I have no spur to prick the side of my intent, only my own vaulting ambition. He notices in himself that he's not a particularly nasty or evil person, but actually it's the only thing is that he wants is his own fulfillment, his own progression, and his own power. And then Hecate continues, and she says that the witches are then going to go and meet with Macbeth again, because he is going to seek them out. He is going to come and find them to know his destiny. And as with the first scene, we see again, they seem to know what Macbeth is going to do before he gets there. They point out that he needs to know his destiny, showing his fragility and his state of mind. But it's an interesting thought when we consider the supernatural as a theme. They seem to know what he's going to do. Is that via wicked means? Is it because of the supernatural presence? Is it due to fate? Is it just because actually by nature human beings are very, very predictable? We're left to judge this as an audience for ourselves. And so the last section of this interesting scene continues with the mysterious imagery of the night, the references to the moon, and the spirits and the witches beginning to cause havoc. And they predict here that the strength of the illusion, the apparitions which they're going to show to Macbeth, is going to accelerate his confusion. It's going to accelerate his downfall into madness, for want of a better kind of word for it. She reminds us of Macbeth's hallucinations, particularly of the air-drawn dagger, which Lady Macbeth references after Macbeth tells her he saw the dagger before him earlier on. And we get this sense of Macbeth really unravelling here, and the witch's involvement in that. She talks then about how he shall spurn fate, scorn death, and bear, he hopes, above wisdom, grace, and fear. She's prophesying again that Macbeth is going to turn fortune around. And we saw this right earlier on in Act 1, Scene 2, where the captain's talking about the battle and talks about how Macbeth was disdaining fortune and things were acting out of the order and out of the way that they should have been. I think to pause and just think a little bit more carefully about this, without Hecate's words here, it might be easier to suggest that Macbeth is powerless to control his own destiny. Here we get this sense of he's drawn by fate, by the supernatural. Would these things have come to pass if the witches hadn't have interfered? And again, Shakespeare doesn't really give us an answer to this. There is no black and white. You are allowed to interpret this in your own way. Consider at this point, do you think without the witches, whether or not this would have happened? Consider whether you think Macbeth was on this path, whether he was fated to behave like this, or whether this has been any of his own decisions that have led him to this point. And then the last little bit here where she says, you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy. And this references again Macbeth saying, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. It's this idea of you can have everything, but if you're not safe, if there's no security in having this, if as a king you are the king, but you are constantly under threat, then actually is it sustainable? Can you survive this? She reveals in these last lines that actually it's Macbeth's arrogance and his belief that he's untouchable that will actually bring about his own downfall. And the scene concludes with this quite eerie song, come away, hark I'm called, and the reference to the foggy cloud again, and how in Act 1, Scene 1, we saw them hovering through the fog and filthy air. So we've got this corruption of nature coming clearly through this scene. And the haunting last line from the first witch saying, we need to hurry up because Macbeth is on his way and Hecate will soon be back to cause more mischief. And as ever, if this is a scene that you are less familiar with, it's worthwhile spending some time making sure that you have revised it thoroughly. Think about going back, drawing it, picture Hecate with the witches alone on the stage, put the quotations around it. Think about using some of the contextual information about Hecate here, just so you've really got it clear who she is. Think about if you were producing it, how would you direct it? A lot of directors do choose to cut this scene out. Think about whether you would include it or if you wouldn't include it if you were the director. If you were to, why, how would you have it done? How would you have Hecate behaving? Or be that little bit more creative, write it. Imagine you are a member of the audience in King James I's court. Write a review about this scene, thinking about how people in the audience would have reacted to it. Really work on teasing out that AO3 contextual ideas here.